Ever had to stand up to someone everyone else feared?
They treated my brothers like royalty while acting like I did not even belong, and if that sounds like I am milking the drama, then you have never watched a mother beam at her sons like honored guests while the daughter quietly drags extra chairs from the garage, pays deposits for the venue nobody bothered to confirm, smooths over the text fights in the group chat, and swallows the kind of comments that would end friendships, but somehow never disqualify family. So when it finally clicked that I was not part of the family as much as the unnamed staff that kept it moving, I did the most defensive and most ordinary thing a woman can do in a house built on unequal gratitude, because I walked away and shut every door behind me. My brothers are Daniel and Mark, and from childhood they were treated like promising executives in a company that had not hired them yet, which meant that the smallest effort on their part drew applause while real results from me drew logistical requests. Because when Daniel landed a short contract, my parents organized a dinner with speeches about potential. When Mark passed a training course, he was suddenly a born leader in their mouths, and when I earned a promotion after a year that almost broke me, they asked whether I could coordinate the next family weekend since I am so good at schedules, and in that moment I understood that my accomplishments were only valuable as free labor for the men who mattered. I tried to set boundaries in the polite way women are trained to use, which means I asked for small adjustments, offered compromises that would keep the peace, and softened my voice so nobody could accuse me of a tone. And the response followed a routine I could perform in my sleep, where my mother tilted her head and told me I can be intense. My father sighed that family is family, and we do what needs to be done. Daniel joked that I take things personally. And Mark suggested that since I do not have kids, I probably have more energy to help, which is the kind of sentence that looks harmless on paper until you live inside it and realize it is a cage with a smile painted on the door. The breaking point was a phone call that began with my mother's gentle voice and ended with me holding the counter to steady myself, because she explained that the holiday this year would be focused on the boys and their families since they have so much going on. And maybe I could help in the kitchen and manage the timing so nobody feels stressed, and I listened like an employee being offered an extra shift on a day off, then said that I would not be coming, that I needed distance, and that I was done being the support beam they pretended not to see. And when the guilt and the history and the little reminders of everything she did for me as a baby started to roll, I let the silence be my full statement. I did not post anything online or throw a scene because loud exits hand people a distraction, so instead I did something quiet that left fingerprints everywhere. As I opened the folder on my laptop that nobody in my family pays attention to because boring work becomes invisible when a woman does it, and inside that folder sat the documents that have kept Daniel and Mark's little empire upright, including the revolving credit line that I guaranteed when the bank would not touch them, the insurance policies I kept current because a missed payment would have sunk them, and the utilities that lived on autopay from my account because the boys are vision people and somehow vision people always forget due dates. I called the bank and revoked my future guarantee on the line, which does not erase the balance, but does force a formal review before any fresh draw is approved. I called the insurer and moved billing off my card and onto the entity with notices routed to the registered address that I control. I drafted a written demand for an accounting under the operating agreement that requires the managing members to produce books and receipts within a reasonable window, and I scheduled a maintenance hold on the property utilities that were drafted under my name so that any service would require confirmation from the person actually responsible. And it felt less like revenge and more like I had finally taken my hands off a machine that only ran because I kept feeding it. The phone began to buzz with unknown numbers and with cousins who never check on me suddenly asking whether I am okay, which is how I knew the alerts had started to land on their side. Because a scheduled draw was paused pending review and an insurance invoice bounced back with a notice to update payment, and I sat on my couch and let the calls roll past while the friends who actually know me sent short messages saying they were proud of me. And I thought about how many times I had swallowed anger to keep everyone else comfortable and how quickly people call you unkind the second you stop offering free comfort. Since a first move should land with clarity, I printed the demand letter and sent it certified to the registered office, forwarded the same notice by email so there could be no confusion about timing. and closed my laptop knowing that by the time the bank review collided with the paperwork, the family story about who keeps this whole show running would finally crack, and when the screen lit again with a number I recognized even without a name, I let it ring. Because the only call I was answering tonight was the one I had already made, and as the last vibration faded, I realized I felt something I had not felt in years, which was steady enough to carry me into the next part where Daniel shows up tomorrow demanding an explanation, and I decide whether to open the door. The morning after I pulled the plug on the favors that had been disguised as family obligations, my phone behaved like a cheap alarm in a motel that keeps ringing after you have already checked out. Because unknown numbers piled on top of cousins I have not heard from in years and aunts who only remember me when they need a place card printed, while voicemails stacked into a scroll of guilt and confusion where my father's voice tried authority, my mother tried pity, Daniel tried charm, and Mark tried sarcasm. Yet underneath the noise there was a very clean pattern that felt almost peaceful once I named it, which was that they were not asking how I was doing. They were demanding that I put the machine back together. Instead of answering, I did what I always do when emotions try to push me into a corner, which is to write things down and make them real in ink. So I opened a new email thread to the registered agent and the managing members of the little enterprise my brothers treat like a trophy, and I treat like a file cabinet. I cited the relevant paragraph of the operating agreement that gives any member the right to demand complete books and records within a reasonable window. I listed the documents with dates and vendors and account numbers because vague requests get ignored while checklists change behavior. I asked for bank statements for the last 2 fiscal years, copies of credit line draw requests, invoices for the equipment they brag about on social media, and the insurance endorsements that would prove they actually covered what they said they did. And I copied the accountant who never gets invited to the holiday table because nothing ruins a fairy tale like a ledger. While the thread was warming up with automatic replies and out-of-office disclaimers that suddenly sounded like confession, I moved through the other quiet levers that only exist because I created them in the first place. And it felt less like revenge and more like returning borrowed tools to their original shelf. So I changed the administrator email on the domain I had registered years ago when the brothers needed a booking page, and I built it in a weekend without fanfare. I pointed the domain to a neutral maintenance page that said booking was temporarily unavailable pending routine compliance review. I transferred the web host billing off my card and onto a pay-on-receipt schedule addressed to the company's registered mailbox rather than my apartment. And, because payouts have a way of concentrating attention where lectures do not, I logged into the payment processor where I am listed as the controlling individual. I removed myself and triggered the standard Know Your Customer review that pauses disbursements until the new documentation is accepted, which meant the stream that kept their optimism afloat was about to slow to a drip and then to a polite error message. By late morning, the panic found a path past the blocked numbers and landed in the lobby of my office with Daniel's insistence wrapped in a smile that used to get him out of traffic tickets. And, because I am done doing backroom conversations that get rewritten before dinner, I asked the front desk to seat him in a neutral conference space, and I brought a folder rather than an apology, where I told him evenly that personal contact remains blocked, that all communications about the company must be in writing, and that the only thing I was willing to discuss in person was the delivery of the documents already requested. Then I slid the checklist across the table and watched the moment he realized this was not a fight about tone or holidays, but a question of receipts and signatures and obligations the bank cares about more than family narratives. He tried the greatest hits, the hurt confusion, the weaponized nostalgia, the joke about me being dramatic, and then the shaky little thread about telling Dad, and I let each one sit on the table without a response long enough for it to deflate under its own weight. After which I explained slowly that the website would return when the records matched the representations they have been making to lenders and vendors, that the credit line would not refresh without a review, that I had every legal right to trigger, and that the payment processor would release funds as soon as the new controlling individual verified identity and ownership, which is to say as soon as someone other than me took actual responsibility for the business they claim is theirs. When he asked whether I understood they had a launch this weekend and a sponsor expecting traffic, I said I understood perfectly and that the timing was not an accident because accountability only arrives when it is inconvenient. Then I stood, thanked him for coming, and told him I would expect the first document packet by the end of the week and the remainder by the date listed in the letter he had not yet opened. And as we walked back through the lobby, his phone started vibrating like an appliance, and his face did the arithmetic that people do when they have always believed the support would magically appear no matter how they behaved. When the elevator doors closed on his confusion, I did the next necessary thing, which was to open my laptop and send a short, formal notice to the payment processor that a change in control had occurred and that any payouts should remain on hold until documentation was complete. I attached copies of the certified letters and the operating agreement clause so nobody could claim surprise. And I CC'd a new council address I had set up that morning because adults put grown problems in grown channels. And then I gathered my bag because there is power in not being available for the next round of theatrics, which is when the security desk called to say Mark had just stepped out of a rideshare and was asking for me by name. While my phone lit with a private number that belongs to the bank's relationship manager, and I realized the next conversation would not be about feelings at all, but about the signatures my father had been collecting for years without telling me. So I let the call ring. Twice more for leverage answered and said we should talk in writing. The bank relationship manager introduced himself by email after my two-line reply that we would keep all communication in writing, and his message had that careful tone people use when they suspect they are standing on a loose floorboard. Because he thanked me for my long support of the credit facility, noted that the most recent renewal required a member resolution and updated guarantor information that had not yet been received, and attached copies of the signature pages for my records, together with a request to schedule a quick call, which I declined politely while asking for full copies of every renewal, draw request, covenant waiver, and signature card since the line was first opened. Then I forwarded the thread to my counsel inbox and told him I would acknowledge receipt after I had reviewed the materials, and in the same breath I asked him to confirm, in writing and without speculation, whether any party had represented that I remained a continuing guarantor after the formal revocation I delivered the day before. By mid-afternoon, the documents arrived like an uninvited memory, and as I read through them I felt a mix of fury and relief, because the pages did not lie and neither did the timestamps, showing that last year's renewal listed me as a guarantor of record based on a scanned signature that did not match my hand in any world where I am awake, with initials typed in a font I have never used on any legal document. And while the bank manager did not say the word fraud, he did say that he noted a discrepancy between my prior written revocation and the renewal file, and that his team had therefore placed a precautionary hold on further advances until the matter could be clarified, which was his careful way of admitting that somebody had leaned on my name like it was a spare ladder, and that the ladder had just been pulled back into my yard. When Mark finally reached me through a colleague who did not realize the situation and buzzed my line by accident, his voice carried that combination of grievance and charm he has used since he was a teenager wearing his first borrowed tie. And he tried to reset the narrative by telling me I was making a scene over paperwork that could be fixed in an afternoon if I would just be reasonable, to which I replied that reasonableness had been my unpaid job for years and that the afternoon had already passed. And then I told him the part he did not know, which is that the brand name they parade on banners and contracts is my registered mark because I filed the application the week I built their first booking page and kept the renewal calendar myself. That the license I granted to the company is expressly conditioned on timely reporting and compliance with written requests for records, and that failure to meet those conditions allows immediate termination of the license with a short cure period at my discretion, after which any public use of the mark becomes infringement on paper and a very expensive problem in real life. He said I would never do that to family and that I was being dramatic over what he called administrative clutter, and I answered that I would do exactly that for the same reason I once guaranteed their line, which is that I am responsible and I act like an adult even when everyone else is busy acting like the hero of their own group chat. And then I reminded him that the payment processor now had a change of control review open and that the disbursements they count on would remain frozen until a new controlling individual verified identity and ownership in a way that did not involve my name, so the cleanest route forward was simple, because they could deliver the full books and records. Sign a short corrective agreement acknowledging my revocation and my ownership of the mark, engage a third-party accountant to bring the filings current, and prepare to fund their growth without my guarantee and without my management of the boring details they never notice until they crawl across the floor like ants. As I spoke, I was also typing, because the fastest path to peace is a paper trail, and in the same long breath I drafted the notice of default under the brand license citing missed reporting and unpaid expenses that had lived on my card long after their small speeches about brotherly hustle faded. I set a short cure window that would satisfy a judge while scaring a marketer. I attached the operating agreement, the certified letter receipt, and the bank manager's neutral confirmation that no further advances would be made, and I CC'd my new counsel address with a note that all further family communications on business matters must travel through these channels and not through my personal phone, which is retired from service until further notice. Before I hit send, the bank manager wrote again to say that in reviewing the file he had also found a personal financial statement attributed to me that listed assets I do not list and a signature date that conflicts with a trip I can prove with receipts. And he asked, almost apologetically, whether I wanted him to refer the matter to the internal investigations team or whether I preferred to initiate my own review, which is the moment the ground under the old family story finally cracked. Because it told me that the men who insisted I was too sensitive when I objected to small slights had no problem treating my name like a spare battery when they wanted the engine to start. I thanked him for the careful handling, asked him to preserve the file and route all questions through email, and said I would respond with instructions after I completed an internal review. Then I opened my original grant of license, updated the termination draft with cleaner language, and prepared to click send, when a new message slid into the thread from an address I recognized as my father's habitually secret account, attaching a single-page letter he had written years ago naming me as the successor manager of a family holding company that quietly owns the warehouse lease and the brand assets. A letter I had never been given, but that now sat in my inbox like a quiet confirmation that the control I am asserting is not a stunt, but a design he expected me to use when the men he prefers finally run out of excuses. And I stared at it for a long breath before I realized that if I filed this letter where it belongs, I could do something that would end the yelling and the triangulation in one clean move, and all it would take would be a signature and a notice to the tenants whose names happened to be my brothers. The letter naming me successor manager did not feel like a gift so much as a sealed instruction that had finally reached its intended reader, so I walked it into a quiet afternoon like a person carrying a sleeping argument, scanned it, filed it with the registered agent together with a brief acceptance signed in my own unambiguous hand, instructed counsel to update the state filings and the internal records for the holding company that owns the warehouse lease and the intellectual property portfolio, and copied the bank so the chain of authority would not depend on anyone's memory or mood when the next story started changing in a family group chat. Once the acceptance was of record, I moved the mechanics that always look petty until you understand how systems run, directing the agent to reroute mail to a secure box I control, resetting the Treasury Authority so checks require 2 signatures that do not include Daniel or Mark, and notifying the landlord's property manager that future rent notices and maintenance requests would come through me as the acting manager, after which I opened the lease and circled provisions that the brothers had never read, the ones about safety compliance and records access and quiet enjoyment that belongs to the landlord as well as the tenant. Because if you treat a lease like a backdrop, you eventually discover it is a script with stage directions that matter when someone stops improvising. I drafted formal notices to the operating company as tenant and licensee, reciting the missed reporting under the brand license, the unpaid obligations that had lived on my card, the unresolved bank review triggered by my revoked guarantee, and the questionable signature on last year's renewal, and I gave a short but reasonable cure window spelled out in calendar days rather than fantasies. making clear that during the cure period the license would be limited to existing commitments and that any new public use of the mark required written approval from me as manager and owner. And then I routed sponsor communications into a simple compliance lane where a certificate signed by an independent accountant would sit next to a payment schedule that honors invoices in the order they arrive rather than the order my brother's friends call to plead. When my mother tried the sentimental route by email, asking whether I remembered the time I baked cupcakes for a school fundraiser and how proud everyone had been of my helpful spirit, I answered with a single careful paragraph that thanked her for writing and explained that future messages about the business must go to counsel and that I wished her well, while my father, who once trained me to watch what people sign rather than what they say, sent a measured note acknowledging the appointment letter and asking only that I act with backbone and fairness, which I chose to read not as manipulation, but as the clearest permission he has ever given me to stop protecting the story that made his sons feel tall. I scheduled a meeting in a neutral office where the windows do not care about anyone's last name, and I laid out the path that would keep the lights on without drama, which required full books and records for the last 2 fiscal years. A corrective agreement acknowledging my revoked guarantee and the misfiled renewal, reimbursement of every auto-pay expense with interest calculated at the standard rate that banks use when they are not feeling poetic, replacement of the guarantor with a surety or with personal collateral that belongs to the people who want the benefit, engagement of a third-party accountant to file all late statements, and consent to a rolling inspection schedule that would keep the lease and the license in alignment rather than in myth. Daniel tried to barter affection for deadlines, and Mark tried to threaten me with public noise, so I placed the bank manager's carefully worded email on the table, the one noting a discrepancy between my revocation and the renewal file together with a personal financial statement that did not match reality. And I explained that cooperation would put us inside a safe harbor where adults correct mistakes and move forward, while refusal would force me to enforce the documents exactly as written, which includes termination of the license after the cure period and, if necessary, action under the lease for material noncompliance that could end in a lockout they would prefer to blame on me rather than on their own signatures. Because leverage only works when you are willing to use it, I hired a security firm on a contingent schedule that activates if the cure window closes without satisfaction, ordered the locksmith to be on standby with instructions to attend only upon written authorization from counsel, and alerted the property manager that a compliance inspection would occur at the end of the week with a checklist that cares about fire extinguishers and electrical panels and occupancy counts, details that sound fussy until a sponsor's risk team asks for proof, and you discover that proof is the difference between payments and apologies. The processor's review continued to hold disbursements. A sponsor politely paused a campaign pending the compliance certificate I had already requested, and the website remained on a maintenance page that did not apologize because I am done writing apologies for men who ignore reminders, while the staff who actually run the day-to-day sent me quiet messages asking whether they should keep showing up, and I told them, in writing, that their pay would be protected through a dedicated payroll account held at the holding company and that no one would be punished for telling the truth to an auditor whose job is not to flatter. By evening, with the notices sent and the cure clock ticking loudly in rooms where people have always depended on my silence to muffle consequences, I wrote one more document that did not care about volume or tone. A conditional termination of the brand license that would become effective if the cure failed, coupled with an assignment agreement prepared for a buyer who values compliance and who has already promised to retain the staff while replacing the public-facing leadership that has mistaken charm for governance. And as I read the draft a second time to catch every place a loophole might hide, my phone vibrated with a message from a name that made me sit all the way up. Because the buyer was not a rival and not a stranger, but someone my brothers never took seriously, a person who has been running the operation in everything but title, and if I signed this assignment tomorrow it would not just change the leadership. It would end the era they built on my back, which is why I closed the laptop, set the pen on top of the folder, and decided that the next step would happen at dawn. At dawn I met the buyer who was not a rival, Not a stranger, and not a savior in shiny packaging, but the operations lead who has been holding the schedule together with spreadsheets and quiet competence, while my brothers perform success on speakerphone. And when Lila sat down across from me with a plain folder and a steadiness I recognized from every late invoice she coaxed across the finish line, I understood that the most merciful thing I could do for the people who actually work would also be the most decisive thing I could do to end the noise, so I signed the assignment of the brand license and the conditional transfer of the warehouse lease to her new entity. Placed both documents in escrow with instructions that they would spring to life if the cure window expired without complete compliance, and in the same breath I executed the termination for cause that would go live the moment the clock hit its last minute. Because endings should be clean even when feelings are not. From there it was procedure rather than theater, and I have learned that procedure is how grown people move mountains without shouting. So we notified the payment processor that the controlling individual had changed and provided the full compliance packet for the new entity. We moved the domain off maintenance and pointed it to a minimal site that announced the same services under the same mark now license to a manager who respects ledgers. We issued staff offer letters that mirrored their current pay while adding a retention bonus funded from the holding company's reserve because loyalty deserves receipts. And we scheduled a walkthrough with the property manager and the safety inspector so the first day under new leadership would not begin with an apology to a clipboard. While counsel sent the cease and desist to the old operating company with a timestamp that did not blink. Because leverage only matters when the other side learns you mean the paperwork, I also sent the bank manager a concise package that included the revocation, the renewal discrepancy, and the assignment in escrow, with a request that the file be preserved and the question of the mismatched signature be handled by internal investigators rather than by family negotiations that end with everyone pretending the pen slipped. And when he acknowledged in that very careful tone that banks reserve for situations where they see what you see but will not name it until their lawyers have measured every sentence, I felt a steadiness that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with finally treating myself as a person who gets to be safe from other people's shortcuts. By early afternoon, the cure window closed with a whimper dressed up as a promise, which is to say that Daniel sent a message insisting the accountant needed more time and Mark sent a photo of boxes as proof of motion. So I instructed escrow to release the termination and the assignment, asked the security firm to meet the locksmith at the warehouse with a copy of the signed order, and told the property manager that keys would be exchanged and access logs reset, after which I sent one last message to the staff list explaining that their jobs continue, their checks will clear, and their work now belongs to a company that values them on paper as well as in speeches, and I meant every word because this was never about performing power. It was about putting responsibility back where it belongs. They arrived after the locks had turned, and I do not say that with glee because there is nothing joyful about watching men you grew up with tug on a handle they assumed would always open. Yet I also will not pretend I felt guilty when Daniel demanded to know how I could do this to family, and I answered that family should not require forged signatures, unreported draws, and bills paid by the person they call dramatic. And when he shouted that I ruined everything, I told him that nothing is ruined that can run without lies, and that if he wants a business, he is free to start one with a bank that believes in him without holding my name as collateral. And if that bank requires a guarantor, then he has a clear choice between growing up and finding someone else to mother him. My mother called from a number I had not blocked yet because some old habits die hard, and she wept the kind of tears that ask the daughter to make the room comfortable again. So I told her gently that I have not ended the family. I have ended my availability as a service, that holidays are not performance reviews graded on who adores the sun's loudest, and that if one day she wants to talk about what it costs to be useful without being seen, I will sit with her in a quiet room where nobody performs and nobody is owed a favor. But today I am busy writing the kind of clean ending that lets the people who work sleep at night, which is why I cannot unlock a door just to make the past feel true. When the last document was filed and the first payroll ran under Lila's signature, when the website showed a simple message about continuity and the sponsor replied with a relieved confirmation that compliance had been received, When the bank manager thanked me for my clarity and said the review would proceed without my further involvement, I finally understood that my next move had not been a stunt or a tantrum, but a plan that had been waiting for me to trust myself. Because I did not set out to humiliate anyone, I set out to stop underwriting a fantasy, and the cost of doing that was ending the version of us where I existed to make sure the men looked tall. If you want the sentence that explains everything, it is this one, that I chose to sell the name they wore like a crown to the woman who actually earned it. I chose to move the lease that kept their story upright to an entity that pays in full and on time. And I chose to let the records speak louder than nostalgia, so now when they tell the tale they will say I betrayed them, and I will answer that I simply turned on the lights, because in the end I did not burn the house down, I just took back the keys, changed the locks, and left the lights on for the people who actually live there.